don't know me, my name is Peter Sjöstedt-H. I'm a PhD. My PhD is on Panpsychism, with a focus on Whitehead, philosopher Whitehead. Before I was here, I was a college lecturer in London for 6 years, and before that I was at Warwick University where I did continental philosophy. Okay, so let me begin. Panpsychism, ubiquitous sentience. I was going to put everything as mental, but that might have looked wrong to start with. Panpsychism is a rare view, I should say, but as you'll find out, I believe personally it's a logical view, and it's becoming more and more popular. So, what I'll be doing is going through a few terms. Here's a quick historical overview. Then I will focus on the third point, which is arguments for Panpsychism. I shall look at some challenges to Panpsychism, and then just end with a summary. So, let's begin. What is Panpsychism then? Well, etymologically, it comes from pan, meaning all, and psyche, meaning soul or mind. So, all is mind. That sentiences exist throughout all of actuality in a hierarchy. So through mankind, to mice, to mycelia, to molecules, to atoms, subatomic particles, everything has a form of sentience. This is different from idealism or pantheism, which might say that everything is mind or part of one mind. It's a plurality, so it's a lot of minds in reality as opposed to that. Okay, so everything is a sentience. What do we mean by sentience? Well, this is one of the old philosophical chestnuts, really. What is consciousness? Very difficult to define. But the word sentience, which comes from the word feeling, means general subjectivity, mentality, experience, something that's epistemically aspatial. What does that mean? When you define actual objects, we can define them in terms of space and time, ultimately, ideally as geometry. But the essence of the mental cannot be defined spatially. So, for example, if I talk about the feeling of satisfaction, even though it might be correlated with certain spatial subveniences, that alone, that spatiality alone, will not convey what satisfaction means, or redness, or blueness, whatever it may be. Consciousness is a complex form of sentience. So, well, this is the way I'm defining it. So, humans have a consciousness. Consciousness includes things such as self-awareness, counterfactuality, so, what-ifs, the conjunction of lots of different types of sentience, like colours, sounds, feelings, and so on and so forth. So, panpsychism, or the version I'm giving, doesn't mean that human consciousness is prevalent in all of nature. It just means that ultimately the basic form of sentience is, and then that exists in a hierarchy, at the top of which we get the human. Bertrand Russell's got another interesting definition of the mental, or the sentient. I define a mental event as one with which someone is acquainted otherwise than by inference. So in other words, we are acquainted with sentience, we don't have to infer that it exists, whereas I infer this table exists as the cause of my perception, for example. Okay, so let's start with the historic overview. The first sort of Greek philosopher, the first philosopher in the Western canon is Thales. He, according to Aristotle, was a panpsychist, they didn't use the term then, hylozoist. Anaximenes believed this. He believed that air, pneuma, was inherent in all things, and that had a form of sentience. Pythagoras, according to Cicero, was what we would today call a panpsychist. Of course, Pythagoras himself hasn't left any writings, so we can't be sure. Heraclitus, sort of proto-Nietzsche, believed that all is ultimately constituted of fire, and that fire contained a form of consciousness. Empedocles, who endorsed evolution, also endorsed the notion that everything can be reduced to 4 elements. He believed that in all of those elements there was an element of psyche or soul. Plato and Aristotle are controversial ones. I'll tell you why I put them on the list. Of course, Plato is famous for his dualism, substance dualism. But in later works, like the Sophist, he talks about the form of being, and that the form of being includes sentience, and that the form of being is an aspect of all particular things. So in that later sense, you could just about include him. Aristotle likewise, if you've studied Aristotle, you know his famous notion about the soul being included within the vegetable kingdom, and also the fifth element of life as inherent in all things. So again, in that reading of Aristotle, he is at least sympathetic towards panpsychism. The word pneuma, the Greek word pneuma, meaning air, which is related to breath, which people used to believe was the soul, was used in the New Testament to mean the Holy Spirit. But with Christianity, with the rise of Christianity, you saw a decline in panpsychism for various reasons. I won't get into that now, but we get into the Dark Ages. Panpsychism re-emerges in the Renaissance with these figures. Patrizzi here was the man who coined the term panpsychism. Bruno was a panpsychist, wrote a lot about it, and of course, if you know about Bruno, he was captured by the Inquisition and burnt at the stake for his views. Now, not only for panpsychism, for a number of other reasons as well, but nonetheless, it's an example of how the church cracked down on such heretical views. Campanella also influential. Modern period, Spinoza. Spinoza, of course, believed that everything was God. God had an infinite number of attributes, one of which was physicality, another of which was mind, but also an infinite range. And mind and matter were sort of reflections of each other, which means that in all forms of matter, you would have an equivalent form of mind. Schopenhauer says the stake of Bruno and Vanini were in Spinoza's mind when he came up with his philosophy. That's what he called nature God. Schopenhauer thought, really, he wasn't really a theist at all. Leibniz, his monadology can be seen as a type of panpsychism, that everything is composed of monads, windowless souls. Schopenhauer, slightly controversial as a panpsychist. I mean, Karl Popper called Schopenhauer Kantian turned panpsychist. And in the modern version of panpsychism, where we emphasize sentience rather than consciousness, Schopenhauer's will, which so influenced Nietzsche's will, is not material, it's not consciousness. Schopenhauer says you need a brain to have consciousness, but the will is a subjectivity. It's not free will, he's very much against free will, but nonetheless there was this ultimate drive underlying all of reality, and in this sense it was a panpsychist. Fechner, Gustav Theodor Fechner, wasn't really a philosopher, he was more of a scientist. He founded psychophysics. He was certainly a panpsychist, I'll quote him later on, but he also sort of extended the panpsychism all the way up to God. So, our bodies are composed of smaller sentiences, our organs, but then societies are a sort of organism with a sentience. The world, planets are organisms, so he's sort of he's a precursor to the Gaia theory, if you know that. And ultimately, you extend all of the hierarchies of sentience to God himself. William James was very critical of panpsychism in the late 19th century, the principles of psychology. He quotes Clifford, comes up with a combination problem, as we'll see later. But eventually, he came to a panpsychist point of view by mixing Fechner with Bergson. Friedrich Nietzsche, that's probably the most controversial name on this list. There's a big debate whether Nietzsche was a panpsychist. I think he was. When you look at his later works, the will to power, he says the will to power is an effect form which underlies all forms of causality. His love, Lou Salome, said that he came back to Schopenhauer. If you don't know Nietzsche, he was a Schopenhauerian philosopher, and he ostensibly totally rejected Schopenhauer, went his own way, but later on in life, I believe he went back to Schopenhauer, and the will to power, which he wrote about a lot towards the end of his cognitive life, I think, is an immanent aspect of physicality. As such, I would include him in this canon. Friedrich Paulsen I just include because he basically was the person who expanded Fichte's views in a very nice, clear manner. German philosopher. Okay, moving on. Henri Bergson, great French philosopher, a vitalist. He might have only included sentience to all living organisms, including bacteria and so on. Perhaps he did not include it to molecules and so on. However, Alfred North Whitehead did. As I mentioned, Whitehead is the person I'm looking at the most. Whitehead was inspired by Bergson, William James, but very novel in his approach. In 1967, in Paul Edwards' Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he talks about, there's an entry on panpsychism. It doesn't mention Whitehead, except for in the footnotes where it says, Whitehead was probably the greatest of all 20th century panpsychists, but it's too complicated to put in this entry. The entry otherwise was very critical in 1967 panpsychism, which I'll go into in a moment, but it was illustrative of the time. I put Bertrand Russell in square brackets because at the moment in the literature, so-called Russellian monism is the thing, you know, the central aspect of panpsychism today. Conferences, in fact, there's a new conference which has just gained funding, which is about Russellian monism. So although it's a question as to whether he actually was a panpsychist or a pan-protopsychist, nonetheless, a lot of his ideas are used by panpsychists today, as we shall see soon. Charles Hartshorne was a Whiteheadian, very clear expositor of Whitehead. C.H. Waddington, here's an interesting one. So he was a biologist, developmental biologist. He was the founder of epigenetics. And this is the big new scientific field which sort of brings back Lamarck into the equation of biology. So after Darwin, the neo-Darwinists said that only genetics determine, you know, offspring and so on. But that's now pretty much been disproved. Epigenetics says that, you know, the expression of your genes can be affected by your environment. And Waddington explicitly said, my science is based on Whitehead's metaphysics. Thomas Nagel. Okay, now we're coming into the modern age. I'm not saying Nagel is a panpsychist, but in 1979 he published a paper called Panpsychism as part of his book, Mortal Questions. And it was the first time that let's say, a serious philosopher took panpsychism seriously again. Why is that? Because in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, there was something called British Emergentism. It's a form of materialism which believed that the mind simply emerged from matter, and they couldn't explain it. They couldn't, for example, chemistry emerges from physicality. But they couldn't explain how that happened. And Samuel Alexander, one of the philosophers there, said, you just have to take it on faith. Natural piety, he called it. You know, we don't know how these molecules create this chemical reaction, but it just does. There's an example of emergence, and likewise, we don't know how the brain causes mental states to emerge. You just have to take it on faith. But then, when quantum physics came along, it could explain the reduction of chemistry to physics. So British Emergentism was left, and then you got all of these very reductionist, materialist philosophies of mind of the 20th century, like behaviorism, identity theory, functionalism, eliminativism, and so on. So it was quite surprising when Nagel came in 1979 to propose panpsychism again, because that went completely against the grain. David Ray Griffin, American philosopher, I should say this. In Europe, Whitehead's philosophy was not particularly influential, except in science, but in America, he caused what is known as process theology. Griffin was an expositor of that, became very influential, but didn't really have much influence on the European discussion. Now, getting into the real modern age. David Chalmers, who I'm sure most of you have heard of here, you know, he famously coined the hard problem of consciousness. In 1996, in the book The Conscious Mind, he talks about panpsychism and says it's a serious contender for this problem of how mind and matter relate. There are all these different theories, all of them have got problems. Panpsychism is a contender, so then when he said that, it sort of became serious academic discipline to a certain extent. The hard problem of consciousness, by the way, is simply a question of how something that's physical relates to something that's mental and ostensibly completely different. Galen Strawson, an analytic philosopher, was at Reading University, but now he's at Texas. He is the main thinker in panpsychism today, I should say. 2006 he came up with a theory saying that if you're a physicalist, you should be a panpsychist as well. And he's just released a new text. I should say, parallel to this, that in neuroscience, Tononi came up with what is known as integrated information theory, which is also a form of panpsychism, and Christoph Koch as well. There's a lot of recent literature that's now flourishing, so there's this one, Mind That Abides. The book on the right from Oxford University Press has just been released, I think this week in fact. I've read one article from it, it looks very promising. Big anthology, collection of essays about panpsychism. Okay, so that was a very fast tour of the history of panpsychism, a lot more to be said, but I've only got 40 minutes or so. So let's get to the main points. I've identified 4 main arguments for panpsychism. Genetic, inferential, abstraction, parsimony arguments. So let's get into them. This now ramifies into 3 other arguments, but generally, this is the strongest argument. The claim that the existence of that which is not essentially spatially describable, sentience, as I was saying with satisfaction and so on, emerges, that's that claim, that which is not spatially describable emerges from that which is physical, spatially describable, is so radical, unobservable, unintelligible, and supernatural that the contrary claim, namely panpsychism, that does not emerge as such, is more reasonable. That's just the outline of the argument. So, it's essentially the opposite of what is known as emergentism, that the mind somehow emerges from physicality, from the brain. But when you really consider that doctrine, it's really quite crazy. Why? Okay, 2 forms of it. Diachronic, temporal genetic argument, and synchronic. Here's a quote from William James. Consciousness, however small, is an illegitimate birth in any philosophy that starts without it, and yet professes to explain all facts by continuous evolution. If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must be present at the very origin of things. So, if you imagine this, if you are not a panpsychist, you must believe that at one point in the historical past, there was just matter, or matter energy, physicality. And then, somewhere in the universe, there was the first inkling of sentience. Maybe some kind of self-replicating molecule, or maybe some amoeba-like cell, or something like this. Suddenly, this popped into existence. You might think, yeah, okay, that's reasonable, isn't it? You know, like just a small little aspect of consciousness creeps in. But really, that is such a radical break from what existed before, even the smallest little desire or fear. It's such a strong claim that this new thing, at least epistemically new, comes into existence, that if you believe that, you have to have a good argument for it. You shouldn't just assume it. Friedrich Paulsen, a Fechnerian. Whence did psychical life arise? Is the first feeling in the first protoplasmic particle something absolutely new, something that did not exist before in any form, of which not the slightest trace was to be found before? That, of course, would be an absolute world roller. It would mean creation out of nothing. Creation out of nothing is an aspect of this. Of course, it doesn't literally mean creation out of nothing, it means out of matter. But by creation out of nothing here is meant the creation of something which is not spatial to something, rather, the creation of something, which is not spatial from something which is. Wright was an evolutionary biologist and a founder of population genetics. He writes this: the evolution of a new organ involves nothing more mysterious than differential growth. Emergence of this kind poses no serious philosophical difficulty. Emergence of mind from no mind at all is sheer magic. We conclude that the evolution of mind must have been coextensive with the evolution of the body. Moreover, mind must already have been there when life arose, and indeed must be a universal aspect of existence, still assuming that mind cannot arise from nothing. So it's not just philosophers, scientists as well who see this point of view. The second aspect of the diachronic genetic argument, as I call it, is generational. So it's not just one point in history where this might have occurred, but all the time in each generation. He writes, the emergence of mind in the course of individual development from the fertilized egg presents a similar problem, and one that is an everyday occurrence instead of a single event in the remote past. It would appear that the mind of a human being must develop from something of the nature of mind in the fertilized egg, and back of this, in the separate germ cells and in the nucleic acid molecules. So, if you think about a fetus developing, it's quite a strange claim to say, suddenly, at 23 weeks, boom, it's conscious. You think there's a gradual emergence of consciousness in that fetus. But if that's so, the original cells must have had a form of sentience. If you don't believe that, you must believe there's a sudden instant in time where it emerges, whatever the smallest amount of sentience would be. Is it not much more reasonable to say that it was there in a lower degree rather than it popped up as a new kind? The synchronic genetic argument is just the logical point, which is atemporal. The ultimate point is this: the principle that there is no brute emergence, no creation out of nothing. It's purely spatio-temporal activity only begets spatio-temporal activity. From the physical only comes the physical. In the brain, no matter the complexity of what's going on, no matter the correlations that we see in brain scans, we're only talking about, ultimately, things moving, like billiard balls hitting another, or transforming from matter into energy, or vice versa. Nowhere would we be able to see where sentience arises from that. So if you don't believe in brute emergence, then you generally would have to accept panpsychism. Brute emergence is unprecedented. It's radical. Nothing else in nature, nothing else in science is analogous to this emergence of mind from non-mind. Emergentists will often say this. They'll say, no, it's very common. The classic one is liquidity emerges from molecules. H2O molecules, you get them together, and from that emerges liquidity. Or the chemical emerges from the physical. The biological emerges from the chemical, and then from the biological emerges the mental. Okay, when you put it like that, it seems reasonable. The problem with that, of course, is that all of those other forms of emergence are physical, spatially describable. That last step into mentality is not the same. You can't follow the flow of that emergence. I mean, with the liquidity, you can see all the molecules. There's a trick, there's a lineage there you can follow easily. Likewise, with the biological, mentality is a completely new, completely different form, and thus that emergentist analogy is actually a disanalogy. So you can't observe the emergence of mind from matter. You can observe correlations. If you've got brain damage, you might notice that that person's mentally damaged as well. But correlation is not sufficient. You just correlate to the report in the brain scan. Untraceable, as I said, causally or constitutionally. So some emergentists say that mind is caused by physicality. Some people say that mind is actually constituted by physical things. We won't get into it, it's a big debate. It's anomalous. There are no known scientific laws which portray how the mental can come from the physical. That just does not fit in with the laws of nature that we have. It's anomalous, non-law-like, not nomological, thus supernatural. So when people talk about panpsychism as being a bit woo-like, a bit magical and whatever, the panpsychist can say the opposite is true. Unintelligible, you can't really imagine how this emergence should take place. Galen Strawson, as I said, is the prevalent panpsychism of today. So let's give this long quote from him. He writes this: in all genuine non-radical cases of emergence of one thing from another, there's a fundamental sense in which the emergent phenomenon, say Y, is wholly dependent on, somehow wholly flows from, that which it emerges from, say X. Otherwise, it simply won't be true, after all, to say that Y is emergent from X. For some part or aspect of Y will have come from somewhere else. So, it's metaphysically far more extravagant and anti-naturalistic to reject the no-jumps, i.e. no-brute emergence thesis, and postulate radical emergence of the experiential from the non-experiential, than it is to postulate non-radical emergence from the human experiential from the non-human experiential. In other words, each of your neurons and all of the bodies in all of the cells in your body will have a form of sentience. That is more naturalistic argument. use Strawson. But why is this not accepted today, generally? Jae-Kwon Kim is probably one of the most respected philosophers of mind out there. He writes, yeah, it's no undue exaggeration to say that we've been under the reign of emergentism since the early 1970s. And here, I won't read it, but he says, however, it's very problematic, this form of emergentism. One of the main problems with emergentism is the notion of mental causation, that the mind can have an effect on the body related to free will. So if I said something like, my proposition, I am conscious, was caused by my consciousness, although that sounds pretty obvious to you, massively problematic to the emergentist, because ultimately, if the mind is totally reducible to the physical, then the physical alone should cause things. The mental alone should have no powers. Yet, the emergentist wants to retain the powers of the mental. Otherwise, they will be epiphenomenalists, which means that you believe that the mind is just an after effect of the brain, has no power. That causes a number of other problems, such as if you really work something out, then if you're an epiphenomenalist, that will have actually no effect on the outcome of what you write. You'll be completely ineffective, just an illusion. Okay, so that's the first argument. There's much more to be said about it, but that's the core of it. Number two, inferential argument, also known as the analogy argument. We can't consistently infer sentience to humans and other animals without inferring it to all entities. Descartes, he said only humans have sentience mind, not even his pet dog. Everything else was mechanical, non-sentient. But the argument here is that there's no reason. I mean, I infer that all of you have a consciousness. I guess that you're not all robots or zombies, like in Westworld. But, I could be wrong. But I infer it, because if I don't infer it, I get into solipsism. I think only I exist, like the Matrix or the demonic, the Descartes Stephen or whatever. Okay, let's get into this a bit more. If we infer other humans have sentience, well, we can't empirically verify this. There's no proof of the matter. I can't look into you to find out whether you really are sentient. I can, of course, see your brain activity and all your physiology, but I can't verify your sentience. I can't see it. So if we were to rely on proof, we'd end in solipsism. I can only know that my own sentience is there, not yours. We generally infer that other animals have sentience, but why not plants? Why not fungi? Bacteria? So on. Why not? Well, the general answer to that question is because it's believed that neurophysiology, a brain, is necessary for sentience. Surely you have to have a brain to be sentient. Well, let's look at that. Here's a great analogy from Fechner, the flute analogy. If I remove or destroy all the strings of a piano, a violin, a lute, then there'll be no tone to the instrument. So obviously the strings are the essential means for producing tones. We are so to say the nerves of these instruments, or the neurons. But now when I hear that the flute, after all, does actually produce tones, in spite of my pretty argument, I cannot see why plants might not be able to produce subjective sensations without having nerves. The animals might be the string instruments of sensation, and the plants the wind instruments. In other words, why do we assume that only neurons are necessary for sentience? What is the basis of that assumption? We know today, through what is controversially known as plant neurobiology, that plants can see with their leaves. The Arabidopsis plant can differentiate 11 types of light, and with these 11 types of light, it reacts accordingly. Now, of course, you might say, yeah, but that's all mechanical, isn't it? Light hits the leaf, causes a chemical reaction, and it moves. That can be explained, in a mechanical fashion. Of course, you could say that to a human as well. Everything that happens to you, you could explain in terms of the cells, in terms of mechanical causality. Interesting as well, interesting point, that you can see without an eye. You don't need sense organs to be able to sense. Let's look at it more formally. We gauge correlations between brain events and mental events. Brain damage, mental damage, so on. Hence we claim, if brain, or at least if neural correlates of consciousness, then mentality. No brain, for example, in plant, therefore no mentality in plant. Okay, seems reasonable, but of course any of you who've done elementary logic with me know that that is a fallacy of denying the antecedent. So put it logically, if B then M, not B, therefore not M, it's obviously obvious, schoolboy error, basic error. The belief that the mentality requires a brain rests on falsely assuming that the condition for human mentality is a necessary condition for all mentality. Also commits this fallacy, come hoc ergo propter hoc, with this, therefore because of this. Just because human mentality is correlated with neural activity, neural correlates consciousness, it's not sufficient to establish a necessary causal condition of mentality. Therefore, we've got actually no logical reason to limit inference of mentality to creatures with brains alone. There's no logical reason why we should do that. You might want to limit it to behaviour instead. Like I think that little animal there's conscious because if I kick it, it sort of runs away. But, it doesn't happen to rocks. Well, if you did that, you'd have to also apply some viruses, microorganisms, so you're on your way to panpsychism already. And then really, the difference between, let's say, a self-replicating molecule and another normal kind of molecule is very minute. So without reason for limitation, the inference is extended all the way throughout nature, and that is panpsychism. Coming from this, all these arguments, by the way, that are interrelated. The abstraction argument is that which uses Russell. It's this: a common notion of matter, energy, physicality is an abstraction that as such omits sentience as its concrete immanence. What does that mean? Let me quote you, Russell. The physical world is only known as regards certain abstract features of its space-time structure, features which, because of their abstractness, do not suffice to show whether the physical world is, or is not, different in intrinsic character from the world of mind. In simpler terms, everything that we see, we only see the shell of. We don't know whether there's an intrinsic aspect of everything we see. Even when you see other people, you really only see their bodies. And again, you infer their consciousness. But you don't know. You can't tell from experience alone whether other people, other creatures have minds. So Russell's point, a bit more complicated than that, is that we should assume an immanence to matter. Now the question is that immanence mind? Well, Russell's a bit sort of vague on that, that's why I don't really include it, definitely as a panpsychist. A lot of people do. Whitehead, who was Russell's teacher and then became his friend, says that the notion of non-experiential matter, like normal matter as we normally think of it, is a result of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, wrongly assuming that part that we experience of something is the whole, the abstraction is the concrete. So we only experience a fraction of reality. If we mistakenly think that fraction is everything, then we've gone wrong, and that explains why, at least from this point of view, you can't make emerge consciousness from matter, because you're trying to get that which is omitted back into reality from the abstractions alone. It's a bit like painting a cake, getting all the colours perfectly right, and then like wondering where the taste is, where the flavour of the cake is. What you've done is you've abstracted from the cake only the colours. You've left the flavour there. But you think that painting of the cake is a cake. And then you get this hard problem of consciousness. Like, oh, well, where's the flavour from this cake? It doesn't make sense. Well, it must emerge, like liquidity or whatever. So, the question ultimately comes to this. Do we assume that matter has experience or sentience, a basic form of sentience? Or do we assume that it has no experience, which is the common view? The burden of proof falls on either side. Why should we assume one side or the other? Yeah, it's more common to assume this, but if you look at the reasons why, and if you look at the fact that assuming that leads to radical emergence, one is more inclined to assume the former. Why is it that we all assume? Why are we not all panpsychists culturally? Well, Whitehead blames Descartes in his legacy. The disastrous separation of body and mind, which has been fixed on European thought by Descartes, is responsible for this blindness of science. Why? Descartes, of course, famously a substance dualist, says the reality is composed of three things, really: God, but then mind and matter. Matter is fully understandable through mathematics. Of course, Descartes was a mathematician. Mind, as I said before, only is part of humans, the soul, and somehow they interact at the pineal gland. what seems to have happened, by the way, Descartes' book Meditations was dedicated to the Pope. Catholics loved it, of course, because only humans had souls, we could go to heaven and so on. Whereas Bruno, who got burnt by the church, well, he believed the opposite. So you begin to see a political reason why panpsychism is not accepted today. Christian views, and ultimately. What happened scientifically is that we got rid of the soul, Descartes' soul, and we were stuck with then pure mechanism. That the world is just mechanical, dead matter. And then from that, I mean, that's very useful in terms of technology and medicine and whatever science, because we can model it and predict the future, create weapons, create medicine, whatever. Yeah, very useful. But there is a point at which that worldview got stuck, and that is this hard problem of consciousness, how consciousness fits into this worldview. So instead of using that mechanism, that mechanical dead worldview, to get consciousness, we should take a step back and reintroduce consciousness into matter in the first place. One principle by which we can do that was suggested by both Whitehead and Schopenhauer. I'll start with Schopenhauer. We must learn to understand nature from ourselves and not ourselves from nature. By which he means this. I know myself that I have this spatio-temporal aspect, body, but also this immanence, sentience. Now, do I analyse myself from what I see out there in terms of pure mechanism and then get stuck with the sentient part, or do I rather invert that and look at nature from myself and think, well, if I've got an immanence, why should not the rest of reality? Whitehead writes it in a bit more detail. It is the accepted doctrine of physical science that a living body is to be interpreted according to what is known of the other sections of the physical universe. This is a sound axiom, but it's double-edged, for it carries with it a converse deduction that other sections of the universe are to be interpreted in accordance with what we know of the human body. Fourth argument brings together the rest, really. Parsimony, Occam's razor. The panpsychism here presented, I should say there are different forms of panpsychism. You can be an idealist panpsychist, you can be a substance dualist panpsychist. The one favoured at the moment, the one I favour, the Whiteheadian version, has the fewest axioms. Why? Well, it's a monism. It's not a substance or property dualism. Mind and matter are the same thing. There's no mysterious emergence in kind, which is required. And of course, there's an emergence of degree, as we shall see, the simpler to the more complex. No additional mental causation is required, which is, as I mentioned, a problem for emergentism. For Whitehead, possibly Nietzsche and others, causality is reduced to perception. In other words, they are the same thing. Can't get into that now, but there's an essay I wrote about it in Philosophy Now magazine on Wonderful. Many dichotomies are effaced, so the organic, the inorganic. One of Whitehead's famous sentences goes, biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms. It's all part of the philosophy of organism. So this notion between the organic and inorganic gets effaced. Substance, attribute, subject, evolution, nature, nurture, so on. Okay, so there are the four main arguments in a nutshell. There are, of course, challenges. First thing that people will say is it's anthropomorphic. In other words, you're projecting human experience onto nature, like children do. You think, it's crazy to say that, rocks and cakes and scissors, whatever, are alive. That's obvious anthropomorphism. Of course, the retort to that is the countercharge of anthropocentrism. Why do you assume that you are so special in this universe that only you have sentience? I mean, ultimately, the charge of anthropomorphism begs the question. It assumes that nature is not sentient in order to make a challenge. Secondly, determining, this is actually very problematic, determining units of subjectivity. Modern panpsychism will not say that tables and chairs are sentient. Because, like Bruno, Leibniz and others, Whitehead, Koestler, there's an important difference between aggregates, like cakes, and holons, or autopoietic entities, such as a squid, fish, an organism, plant, whatever. Very important difference. There's no modern panpsychist who would say that a chair or a door is conscious. in itself. No, it's a community of those things which are partly self-sufficient, autocreating. In Doyle's case, it's like a community of molecules. But the problem is, how do you actually really differentiate that? For example, if you think about the human heart, is that a separate sentience? But it sort of flows into everything else, doesn't it? With its veins and so on. So how do you really delineate these subjectivities? The biggest problem, though, of panpsychism, or the most famous problem, is a combination problem. How do separate sentiences, let's say all the neurons in your brain, combine into a unified sentience, your sense of apperception, your sense of self? An old problem stated by Lucretius, Cudworth, Kant, interestingly, William James. Let's go to Kant quickly. For his 3 critiques, he wrote a book called Dreams of a Spirit Seer about Swedenborg, this mystic. And in that footnote to that book, he mentions the combination problem for panpsychism. In the first critique, Kant's most famous work, the Critique of Pure Reason, he actually entertains the idea of panpsychism and leaves it there. Herbert Fiegel said this tract in Kant might have inspired Schopenhauer and others. But in the third critique, the Critique of Judgment, Kant rules it out and says, actually, no, can't be right. Because, though, he's an idealist. Because he says the notion of matter is something that I project, phenomena, and therefore, by definition, it is lifeless. Because it's not really there. So the combination problem, a lot of literature at the moment seeking to solve that, but it is tricky. I mean, Whitehead endorses combination. It's the ultimate aspect of his metaphysics, but that's another time. Derivation problem from Colin McGinn, similar, has certain types of sentience merge into other types, like feelings from a basic organism into colours, for example. So, interestingly, there is a form of emergence in panpsychism, like basic sentiences coming out to more complex forms until we reach the human, sort of self-aware consciousness, whatever. It is problematic, of course. It's not as radical an emergence as that in emergentism, from the physical to the mental. It's from the mental to the mental. Nonetheless, how that operates is still up for debate, up for work. And then there's this classic problem of unverifiability and unfalsifiability. I can't verify that matter has a sentience, and there's no way of me falsifying it. Therefore, it's meaningless and/or unscientific. Of course, it's not scientific doctrine; it's metaphysical doctrine for a start. Meaninglessness. I mean, like I said right at the beginning, you could say that about other people as well. I can't verify your consciousness. Does that mean that my proposition that you have consciousness is meaningless? Of course not. This is one of the reasons why logical positivism fell, for problems like the minds and so on. So, that was a very fast tour of panpsychism. So there are problems. But my personal viewpoint at this moment in time is that the problems are there, but the problems in other metaphysical theories of how mind and matter relates are stronger. Thus, I think that panpsychism is the most reasonable point of view as regards what Schopenhauer called the world riddle, which is how matter and mind are related. Thank you. So questions then, I guess.
To what degree do you think there is an actual analytic distinction between, say, saying that inorganic matter or whatever has sentience and saying that it doesn't?
I don't understand really.
So what's the actual difference between saying that the fundamental parts of this table, for instance, have degrees of sentience, and being a materialist and saying that, plants can interact and sense things or whatever, because your version of sentience seems so soft, almost to...
Well, Thomas Nagel addresses this. He says that if you approached something in space which you didn't know, of which you didn't know what it was, so if you might think it was a big organism or a spaceship, the question, what is it like? Nagel's famous one, actually, from Sprigg, what is it like to be a bat, he read. The question as to whether it's like something to be that spaceship, in other words, if it has a subjectivity, is a meaningful question. There is a true or false answer to that. Whereas, of course, materialists will immediately say it's false, it doesn't have one. Whereas panpsychists will say no, there's a truth or falsity to answer there. So in that sense, you can say there's a difference.
Right, it was just simply because you said that you don't think, or at least modern panpsychism doesn't think that these things have consciousness, but they do have sort of soft degrees of sentience.
Yeah, okay, so what it's like to be something doesn't need consciousness, like the higher form, but it just needs sentience. Subjectivity, a point of view. As opposed to, let's say, a sum, 2 plus 2, doesn't have its own point of view.
Right. And so you'd say that's more than just, say, a plant having phototropisms and that sort of thing.
The assumption is that there's more to a plant than a simple mechanism, yeah.
The way you speak about sentience and consciousness is almost consciousness is a subset or an aspect of sentience.
It's a highest form.
Yeah. So does that mean therefore like the sentience in plants and the sentience in genetically very distinct animals from us, the form that their sentience actually exists, is that lower than consciousness or is it a different form of?
Higher, lower is just, it's just expression. I mean, they're different.
Because if you take it to, for example, the Mabel's question of the alien, or more specifically on the issue of anthropomorphizing and anthropocentrism, even if they have a sentence, I still can't talk about it because it's not my form of sentence.
Okay, you might not be able to understand, like Wittgenstein famously said, if a lion could talk, we wouldn't understand it anyway. But what does that mean? Does that mean that it doesn't have a sentience? Of course not. It just means that you would not be able to understand it. I mean, probably there are other humans who have certain forms of sentience which you couldn't understand either. Poets famously say, if you don't know love, you wouldn't understand a love poem.
But Wittgenstein would go so far as to say you cannot talk about it. And therefore the whole concept of panpsychism is kind of, as interesting as a concept it is, it's...
Well, I don't accept Wittgenstein's philosophy at all here. I think, AJ's criticism of it, I think, is pretty flatal. And,
but in terms of that linguistic aspect,
just because you can't talk about something doesn't mean it's there. I mean, I can't. Charles Hartshorne, one of the Whiteheadian panpsychists, he says another reason for the non-adoption of panpsychism is it's very hard to imagine what it's like to be a molecule, whatever it may be. Of course it is. I mean, I can only infer how you think personally. You might have a completely different point of view to me. But I infer it. I don't deny it. Because I can't imagine, let's say, what it's like to be, I don't know, that, right? Just because I can't imagine that doesn't mean, therefore, that doesn't have consciousness or sentience. It just means that I'm limited in my imaginative capacity.
We do have a question from Facebook. By Dennis Kaya, what is consciousness defined as in this context, and what is the precise definition?
As I said right at the beginning, this is a big question that all philosophers get. I mean, like I said, I distinguish there general sentience, which is a subjectivity, a point of view. As Russell says, something that you know by acquaintance, not from inference. That I define as sentience generally, which includes like desires, fears, perhaps, and so on. Consciousness, as I define it, now, of course, I've been a Wittgensteinian, you would know that, every word is, it's use only, but the way I'm defining it is as a complex form of sentience, where a number of different forms are combined, you get sound, colour, feelings, and so on. Also, a longer memory, also a greater imagination, counterfactuality, what if I did this, what if I did that, which allows one to play chess, and so on and so forth. So, you generally think of sentience in terms of hierarchies of complexity. Ultimately, it's related to how much control you have over the environment. But, this is a big philosophical question. I won't answer what consciousness is. It's...
No, just your definition of it.
But that's my definition, yeah.
You said that some things could be sentient without having consciousness, right?
According to my definition of consciousness.
So, don't you then still have a problem with emergence then? Because things may be sentient to an extent, but you haven't explained how many different combinations of sentience then spring into consciousness. For you to undermine the problem of emergence that you talked about at the beginning, I think you have to have consciousness, surely, at that level.
Well, that is related to the combination problem I mentioned and the derivation problem, of course, and it is a problem. But is it, I mean, the point of panpsychism, in a way, is like rejection of emergentism. So you're saying that, but if you need emergentism anyway, that's annulled itself, right?
Yeah.
The difference is that the emergentist, in inverted commas, the non-reductive physicalist, as they call themselves, people like J. King and so on, their emergence is more radical. It's from the physical, which again is describable in terms of space and time, to that which is not describable in terms of space. That is a radical jump, which, like I said, has no, you can't trace that lineage. There are no scientific laws which allow it to happen, so bridge laws as they're called. Whereas the emergence of basic forms of mentality to complex forms of mentality is problematic, but it's less problematic because it's still from the same kind.
And how do you explain the emergence of sentience from physical? You have the issue of emergence there as well. If you're saying that consciousness comes from the non-physical sentience contained within physical matter, then you can have the same issue of emergence from physical matter to sentience, then surely.
I never claim that sentience comes from physical matter. I'm
Right.
saying in the first place, physical matter is an abstraction of that which includes sentience in the first place.
In the light of the idea of panpsychism, how would you describe the difference between the consciousness that you can produce like in a computer and one which emerges out of the organic, or not necessarily emerges, but the one which we have as organisms? Because it's kind of, you have different, you know what I mean, as like, I don't know, it's because yeah, really interesting question.
Computer? Yeah, you're talking about
Yeah.
the emergence of software from hardware?
Well, the idea of consciousness, being able to create consciousness,
What do I think about the possibility of creating consciousness artificially, you mean?
yeah, how would it be different necessarily, or from human consciousness or animal consciousness?
Yeah. Well, this is, very ultimate answer is don't know. But I'll say this: I mentioned integrated information theory at the beginning, which bequeaths consciousness or sentience to any unit where the information is integrated. So that even actually includes mobile phones. Now, I don't buy that. I would see a mobile phone as an aggregate, but they do. Beyond that, how does it relate to the possibility of creating autonomous robots or conscious robots? I think the possibility is there. Interestingly, of course, if you accept that possibility, you will also accept the fact that you needn't have a brain to have consciousness. Well, I'm going to stay agnostic on that one because I don't know, but it's something I do think about. And if you're a Leibnizian panpsychist, I'll say this: for him, every organism, everything is an organism, consists of sub-organisms, which consists of sub-organisms, cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and so on, ad infinitum. So, to be an organism, you need that full scale of autopoietic organisms. Whereas a robot, as we understand them today, will not have that full scale. Eventually come to a point of particles which are not organically related to the movement of the robot as a whole, like the iron bars and skeletons, something like that. But that's if you're a Leibnizian. That's got its own problems. Someone else? Okay.
Despite the fact that you might believe that sentience doesn't emerge from physical, it appears to me that it is still reliant on it in terms of the arena on the platform where sentience can exist is in a sense purely physical. And not only that, but whereas you might claim that it's not, it must therefore then be independent, and there's not necessarily a case of sentience transferring or being, not existing without the physical. Whereas there is an example of the physical existing without the sentience. Therefore, there's not exactly parallelism. There's sort of reliance there, a relationship.
Yeah, there is. I mean, under Whitehead's form of panpsychism, which is the strongest, I think, You have to have what you would call physicality to have sentience, because they are the same thing, ultimately. It's just that we don't see it all. But of course that means, it's not a dualism, so you couldn't transfer one's sentience from a body into something else, Actually, there is one passage of Whitehead where he does allow for that possibility. It's very anomalous, it's a strange one. But generally speaking, no, that's not possible. So, no physicality, which is actuality anyway, including all the force fields around the air, but there's no sentience. So in that sense, they are interdependent, because ultimately, if you believe they're abstractions, they're the same thing anyway.
But yet they're aligned. Because if you're saying that they're independent, then
I'm not saying they're independent. I'm saying they're identical. I'm saying that those things that you call independent are abstractions from the concrete whole, which includes both. That doesn't answer your question. I don't quite.
Yeah, I
quite
think
getting it.
In the sense that what is trying to be achieved in panpsychism is almost a one-to-one relationship. That there is an identity in sentience, an identity in physicality, but the way that they bridge the gap is by saying that they're one and the same thing. Yet they're so different.
Okay. Right, here's the important thing. Does panpsychism solve the hard problem of consciousness? No, it doesn't, per se. The interesting thing is, where you would solve this ultimate hard problem of consciousness is in determining the nature of the abstraction. If you've determined that nature of the abstraction, matter for mind, then you will solve the hard problem of consciousness. Is that feasible for humans? Possibly. I don't know. No one's solved it so far, but I think that is the direction to go. More? So, are you all panpsychists now? Of course you are. You have one question?
Just curious, how exactly and through what sort of process or mechanism or outlined way can something like a subatomic particle have subjective qualitative experience? Because I can see with a brain, or even perhaps with a plant, I can maybe stretch to where it's coming from, but through what?
Why differentiate a plant from an anatomy?
Because we can know that plants are capable of sensation and phototrophic behaviour and that sort of thing, whereas an atom.
Do you think an atom can't sense?
I don't.
This is where I mentioned this. It gets too complicated. This thing about Whitehead's reduction of perception and causality.
Right.
We believe that atoms cause other atoms to move and so on, right? Now, for Whitehead, that is perception, right? When something has an influence over something else, it's sentient perception on the intrinsic side, whereas we see that as movement.
Right. And
again, you assume that so that you don't get radical emergence later down the line, so you don't get this massive rift. But ultimately, all causality, everything that an atom does is its relation to everything else, anyway, that's process. Whereas process philosophy, all of those interactions are sentient, have a sentient aspect. But of course, that you get really radical then, but that's why it's ultimately very parsimonious.
Sure.
So you get Whitehead's view of prehensions, as he calls it. An atom is actually a massive community of the ultimate constituents of reality, which he calls actual entities. An actual entity is an occasion of experience. There's another name for it, and that involves fusion of the environment into this subjectivity, this very temporary actual entity, which gains a satisfaction. That's the fundamental nature of reality, and then that sort of is mirrored in higher levels. But ultimately, at the very ground level, there's perception. Like I said with the plant leaf, right? You think perception, sensation requires sense organs. Not really. This is a linguistic trick. Like a leaf is an eye. You can imagine a leaf as sort of retina of the eye, can't you? As it takes in light and whatever. So if you accept that light hits a leaf, creates a reaction in the plant, whatever that may be, then why not accept it for an atom as well?
It's just how do you justify that jump from perception to subjective experience? Isn't that what this is fundamentally based on? Oh, all right, okay.
Well, perception is subjective experience. In this?
Not necessarily.
Well, if you don't, you get the emergence problem.
Right.
Yeah, do you have any any ideas about the political implications of a world in which everyone agreed that plants have consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, Switzerland, like a few years ago, I can't remember the details now, but it gave rights to plants and trees and whatever because of panpsychism arguments.
So what can we do now?
Also, how does it relate to how do you relate to vegetarianism? Vegetarians generally say, we don't want to cause suffering or don't want to kill, sentient beings, but then you can't eat, right? So it has an effect on that. I mean, vegans generally respond by saying, okay, even if you accept that they do, animals still have more sentience and suffer more because they can imagine the future and so on.
Which there's a degree of suffering now.
I mean, I'm not utilitarian, so I wouldn't accept it at all anyway. But it basically it's a spanner in the works of veganism. That's just a fact. Yes.
And no, it's just about the point I was thinking if the light is conscious of if the plant is conscious of light, it doesn't necessarily mean it can feel pain and stuff like that.
No, not necessarily. And actually, one of the problems with panpsychism, as was mentioned, you don't really know how other beings feel unless.
And you do see it's affected by the sun, though. And you don't see it's affected by pain.
Interesting. Okay, you can make inferences like everything, but I'll say this. They've recently found out certain plants, like the mimic plant, can remember. If you drop a drop of water on it every 20 seconds or so, it will, first of all, it will close its leaves. There's plants you touch them, they close their leaves. After a while, though, it gets used to it and knows, okay, it's not a threat, and it just stays open. Not quite a plant, but slime mold can navigate a maze, interestingly. Of course, that doesn't prove sentience in any way, but nonetheless, it makes plants and fungi and slime molds more akin to animals. If you look at a plant and fast forward, it looks very animal-like. Think about the dodder plant, right? I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a parasitic plant. It doesn't really have much of a root, so when it grows, it sort of spins around, sniffing for other plants in its vicinity. And if it finds one it likes, it creates a tomato plant for some reason. It then wraps itself around that and siphons off all the nutrients. Of course, you can explain that purely mechanically. It doesn't mean it has sentience, but my point is that plants, because they live in a sort of slow sentience, react very slowly and haven't got locomotion. We assume that they don't have sentience, but really, this could be to do with the time frame of us compared to them. And like I said, although you can seemingly explain plants' reactions mechanically by chemical reactions, you can do exactly the same for a human being.
I think we'll stop now. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.